Awareness about the human rights situation in Bahrain. I want to acknowledge one of our commission staffers, Jordan Tama, who is, this will be his last hearing, but he has been on loan to us. He teaches at American University, and he has been incredible in helping us coordinate hearings on a whole range of issues, as well as letters to the administration, and to leaders of countries expressing concerns about human rights. So I want to make a special thank you to him. 14 months ago, the Lantos Commission held a hearing on human rights in Bahrain. At that hearing, we learned that the Bahraini government had engaged in a harsh crackdown after the outbreak of major protests in early 2011. In June 2011, the King of Bahrain appointed an independent commission chaired by international law expert Dr. Cherif Bassiouni to investigate the government's response to the unrest in Bahrain. Last November, this Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, BICI, issued its report, which found that the Bahraini authorities systematically used excessive force, torture, and forced confessions against protesters, unjustly prosecuted medical personnel who treated injured protesters, and fired many employees suspected of sympathizing with the opposition. The Commission also issued 28 recommendations designed to bolster human rights protections and remedy abuses. In the 9 months since the release of the BICI report, the Bahraini government has taken positive steps to implement some of these proposals, including the transfer of some trials from military to civilian courts, the reinstatement of some fired workers, and the production of a new code of police conduct. But those reforms, quite frankly, are incomplete. And I am very concerned that some of the most important recommendations, in particular the recommendations calling for accountability at all levels of the chain of command for human rights abuses, the release of individuals who have only engaged in peaceful political expression, and the integration of all Bahraini communities into security forces have not been implemented. More generally, I am very concerned that the human rights situation in Bahrain has deteriorated in recent months. Credible reports indicate that government security forces have been using deadly tear gas excessively, beating protesters outside of formal detention centers, and harassing injured protesters seeking emergency medical care. Bahraini authorities also appear to be stepping up their repression of activists and opposition leaders. And I'm very troubled that Nabil Rajab has been sentenced to 3 months in prison, even though the Bahraini government has presented no credible evidence that he has advocated or engaged in violence. Mr. Rajab and all detainees who have only engaged in peaceful political expression should be immediately released. On the other hand, some protesters are engaging in violent attacks on security personnel, and such violence is also completely unacceptable. The use of violence by protesters or by security forces is counterproductive and only strengthens hardliners on both sides. I would also like to make a plea at this hearing for the Bahraini government to allow non-governmental organizations greater access to Bahrain. Bahraini authorities have placed significant restrictions on NGO visits and denied a number of NGO requests for visas. This does not help the Bahraini government's cause, as it creates an impression that the government has something to hide. Finally, I want to say a word about U.S. arms sales to Bahrain. I firmly believe that the United States should not provide any military items or services to Bahrain until there is important and lasting progress on human rights in Bahrain. I understand the close security relationship between the United States and Bahrain, and I believe that U.S. security interests in the Middle East will be best served by the implementation of reforms that give all Bahraini communities greater confidence in the Bahraini government and help to unify the Bahraini people. I urge the administration to withhold any further arms sales to Bahrain until there is major progress toward full implementation of all of the BICI recommendations. And with that, I will now turn this over to my colleague from Indiana, Mr. Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Whoa! Is that better?
Maybe we get you a different mic. Try this one.
Try that one. Okay, sure. Is that better? Good, good. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate being here today, and I look forward to hearing the witness's testimony. One of the things that I've found over the years is when you look at something from afar, many times it isn't as accurate as when you look at things up close. And toward that end, I went to Bahrain a few months ago, and I went to the University of Bahrain. I met with the Crown Prince. I met with people in my office who are part of the opposition, and I've done my best to try to get a better lay of the land than what you get when you look at it from reports and things like that. I also talked to the commander of the Fifth Fleet when I was there. I also talked to our intelligence officers. And the intelligence officers, I can't go into some of the classified information I received, but I talked to some of our to our intelligence officers, and found that there are some things to be concerned about from people coming in from outside the country, from Iran and across the Persian Gulf, to try to take advantage of the unrest that's taking place in Bahrain. The leaders of Bahrain have passed the commission, or the report. They appointed the report of the National Commission charged with the recommendations, and the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry report I brought with me. It's a couple of things I'd like to point out. First of all, nobody likes human rights violations. They're horrible. We see them in other parts of the world. We see them in China. We see them in a whole host of areas. And wherever there's human rights violations, we ought to do something about them. But I think we need to have as much information about those human rights violations and what's taking place before we make a predetermined decision. Now, of the report from the National Independent Commission of Bahrain, there have been 26 recommendations. 18 of those recommendations have been complied with. There's work continuing right now on 7 of them, and they're in various stages of implementation. 1 is not yet applicable. Bahrain's begun the process of rebuilding religious sites which were demolished during the unrest. The former police chief of Miami-Dade County in Florida, Chief John Timoney, has instituted a new police code of conduct. 92% of the workers who lost their jobs because of the unrest have now received jobs again, and so they're back to work. There's still 8% that they have to deal with, and they're working on that right now. One of the things that surprised me when I talked to the leadership in Bahrain, as well as the other people who live there and work there, was that the opposition has been asked to sit down at the conference table to work out some of the differences, and they have declined to do that on a whole host of issues and a whole host of cases. I believe that Bahrain has a ways to go, and I believe that the leadership over there does want to solve this problem without further violence and bloodshed. I also believe that it's in the United States' best interest to continue to have a viable and strong relationship with Bahrain. As I said before, we have our Fifth Fleet there, and right now to start with the problems we face in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Egypt, throughout the entire Persian Gulf region and the Middle East, I think it would be a tragic mistake for us to predetermine whether or not the Bahraini government is trying to comply with these recommendations of the Independent Commission. Let me just say that if I were talking to the government over there, and I have talked to them, I would say that everything that is humanly possible should be done to make sure that there's no indication that human rights violations are continuing and they're being handled in the wrong way. The other side of the coin is some of the policemen who have families, as well as the people in the opposition, have had their houses firebombed. I haven't read anything about that in any of the reports that I've seen, but I talked to the policemen myself, and I talked to the people who are aware of that in Bahrain. There was one policeman who was gone. He was working, and some demonstrators took Molotov cocktails and threw them at his house, and his wife and his children were there. Now, those sorts of things also are violations of people's human rights, only it's on the other side of the coin. So let me just say that I think that we ought to pay attention to human rights violations wherever they occur, Bahrain or any place else. But I truly believe, after having visited with our intelligence people, with the commander of the Fifth Fleet, with people on the street, and with people in the government, that Bahrain is trying to fix this problem and make sure that the situation is improved dramatically. And they have, in my opinion, I see that Mr. Wyden's arrived, Senator Wyden, and they have, in my opinion, taken strides on almost all of the instances to solve this problem. 18 of the, what was I said? 18 of the 26 issues, and there are 7 of them that are currently under the stages of implementation. And I'd like to just say, if the opposition's here, and I presume some representatives of the opposition is here, I would urge you, under whatever circumstances are necessary, to sit down with the leadership in the government and try to work things out. To say no because you have strong differences on the implementation of these issues just doesn't make any sense. It's far better to sit across the conference table and try to work out your differences than to continue with unease in the society. And with that, I thank the gentleman for giving me this time.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his statement, and before I yield to my colleague from California, Ms. Woolsey, I want to submit to the record statements provided to the Commission by Congressman Jim McDermott, the Bahraini ambassador to the United States, Hoda Ezra Ibrahim Nono, Hussein Abdullah of Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain, Brian Dooley of Human Rights First, and Walid Malouf. And I also want to submit for the record the report, Weaponizing Tear Gas, published today by the Physicians for Human Rights, and also submit to the record an article in today's New York Times entitled "Bahrain is Criticized for Its Torrent of Tear Gas Use." At this point, I'd like to yield to my colleague from California, Ms. Woolsey.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Good afternoon. I'm so grateful that the Lantos Commission has convened this hearing, and I thank the 2 chairmen, Congressman McGovern and Wolf, for making this happen for us. And I'm so thankful to all of the witnesses who are offering testimony this afternoon. Last October, I had the privilege of traveling to Bahrain with Representative Fatima Vega and with the late Congressman Payne. We had an opportunity to meet with many government officials, with leaders of the opposition, and with Dr. Bassiouni. I think I said, did I say it? I think I said it right. We met with medical personnel, those who had been detained, and with those who led the protests in February and March of 2011. I came away from that trip with a greater sense of urgency than I had expected, and also with a greater conviction that Bahrain needs political reforms to strengthen human rights and democratic participation. The appointment of the Commission of Inquiry was an important first step. It appears to be a good faith attempt by the government to investigate the excesses of the crackdown and assume accountability. But there has to be follow-through. There has to be real action. If Bahrain is going to move forward as a freer, more open society, the inquiry has to have real meaning. The Commission's recommendations need to be properly and swiftly implemented. I believe there has been progress on this front, but half measures won't do. We must be vigilant in the United States. We must insist that the Bahraini government lives up to its obligations. The people of Bahrain took to the streets. They risked their lives and their limbs to demand a greater voice in the affairs of their nation. Their concerns must be heard. A system where the majority Shia population is shut out from the seats of power is simply not sustainable. When I was in Bahrain, I raised a few key concerns, in particular civilian trials for the doctors and medical personnel who had initially been tried in emergency courts, the freeing of political prisoners, unemployment compensation for those who were not given their jobs back, and amnesty for labor unions. There's been, as I said, some positive steps in these areas. The agreement calling for the reinstatement of more than roughly 2,000 workers was a key to restoring Bahrain's status within the International Labor Organization. On the other hand, I was very disappointed that an appeals court upheld the conviction of 9 doctors this June. Political prisoners continue to be detained. Tear gas and rubber bullets continue to be used against the protesters. Under the circumstances, I believe the decision to give green light to a massive arms sale to Bahrain was premature at best. Bahrain is not Gaddafi's Libya. It's not Assad's Syria. But then again, that's a pretty low bar to set, isn't it? I don't think any country should be left off the hook because of being not the worst offender in the neighborhood. We should expect our allies to promote civil liberties and democratic participation, to protect the rights of women and ethnic minorities, to empower their people and be responsive to them. The government of Bahrain has started to take promising steps, as I've said, but as a passionate human rights advocate throughout 20 years in Congress and my whole life before that, I continue to expect that there will be a real lasting and meaningful reform. So I thank you, and I look forward to today's testimony.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your statement. And before I introduce Senator Wyden, I just say to those who are standing, feel free to use any of the free chairs here, because I always feel bad when people are standing during these hearings, but you can take advantage of any chairs. But at this point, I'm very happy to introduce the Honorable Ron Wyden, U.S. Senator from Oregon, who has been a leader on the issues of on a whole range of issues, human rights issues in the United States Senate, but especially on this, and I appreciate your voice being raised, and we welcome you here, and please feel free to say whatever you want to say.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman McGovern. I don't want to make this a bouquet tossing contest, but it has been great to work with you. Your leadership on this issue has been extraordinary. And I also want to note the fact that particularly we Westerners, and I see my friend Congressman Woolsey here, also got a chance to serve with Congressman Burton. We Westerners, particularly when we think of human rights, we think of Tom Lantos. Tom Lantos again and again stood up for human rights, and as Congressman Burton knows, he always wanted to work across the aisle on these issues with you, with Congressman Wolf. It seems that when there were important human rights causes, Tom Lantos was a force for bringing Democrats and Republicans together. That's what I want to see if I can help do this afternoon, just for a few minutes, because I don't think it's a Democratic or Republican issue. I think this is something that is a moral challenge, and we've got to find a way to make real progress. The root causes of the great unrest in Bahrain, in my view, are unaddressed and unresolved. And we've essentially seen these last, 17 months, and the back and forth has continued. Congressman McGovern notes the tear gassing, most recently. We've got to have a political solution here. That's what it's going to take. It's going to take a political solution, all sides coming together. Now, in November of last year, the King took a very significant step, setting up the Bahrain Commission, the Bahrain Commission of Independent Inquiry. It certainly wasn't perfect. It was limited in scope, but at least it resulted in a number of recommendations. So when I take stock of those recommendations, because I think it's important, when you see an important inquiry like that, to take a look at the recommendations, when you add it all up in response to the recommendations, you see mostly foot dragging. I mean, you can have a debate about whether there was a little more of this or a little more of that, but what the result has been is frustration and this downward spiral of back and forth violence, and you've got protesters and the police, and back and forth it goes. And certainly there's been some targeting of children. The jailing of Nabil Rajib, the president of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, concerned me greatly because it seemed to me that he faced these kinds of sanctions simply for criticizing the Bahraini government on Twitter. I mean, he basically got criticized for speaking out. And it underscores what Human Rights Watch, in my view, rightfully consider an escalating trend of attempting to silence the dissidents and members of civil society groups. Now, the report explicitly recommended that the government of Bahrain review convictions, commute sentences, and drop outstanding charges against all persons charged with offenses involving nonviolent political expression. Again, if you look at what the response has been, and I think we've got to do that as we try to find a way to a solution here, what you've seen are the continuance of the arrest, the imprisoning of Bahraini citizens for expressing political views the government doesn't agree with. And the response of our government, in my judgment, has been to some extent to reward bad behavior, with the arms sales. And to me, to systematically, to reward regimes that systematically and oftentimes violently repress democratic demands, I think is a mistake. And I understand that certainly a significant number, not all of the items being sold to the Bahrainis are for external defense capabilities and not, crowd control. But my concern is what the message sends to the wider region and the world at large when our country, who we all here in this room revere for our values, and again, it's not Democrats, not Republicans, it's our reverence for our values. What does it say when democratic aspirations are crushed and these peaceful activists get repeatedly hauled off to jail? And in my view, it was not helpful when one of the recipients of those items was the Bahraini Defense Force, a government entity that was implicated in the deaths of unarmed protesters by, again, the independent report. So as a party to the international covenants on civil and political rights, the government of Bahrain is obligated to protect the right of all to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. And with that, there has also been an obligation to abide by the United Nations basic principles on the use of force and firearms. And that, as you all know, requires that law enforcement officers use force only to the extent necessary to achieve lawful purposes, and wherever possible, only after there's been a warning that it is about to be used. Again, based on the evidence that we've picked up, there has not exactly been impressive compliance with those particular rules. That's not, in my view, progress. Now, compounding this, the government of Bahrain recently moved to deny all requests, as we understand it, for permits for peaceful protests, and that this has essentially been the policy since the end of June. This includes not allowing opposition groups to peacefully assemble in any part of the country. And certainly this, in my view, runs counterproductive and runs the risk that Bahrainis who we want to be part of this solution, to be part of this reform process where people come together, are going to be even more alienated, and you turn the moderates into the extremists who are going to be the biggest challenge at any kind of solution. So obviously the clock is ticking here. Time's running out for finding a way to bring people together. And I just want to close with a couple of points in terms of using all our levers, all of the possible levers for influence with the Bahrainis. Now, I chair over in the Senate, on the Senate Finance Committee, the Subcommittee on International Trade and Competitiveness. And I have consistently supported every opportunity when I was over here in the House and in the Senate to try to expand trade. And just recently, with Chairman Baucus tied up with the Super Committee, managed a significant part of the 3 free trade agreements. So I've always felt that expanded trade can be a great force for progress. It is one of the tools for real social progress and improving the quality of life of people. But free trade cannot mean trade free from honoring commitments. And I'm concerned that Bahrain's labor commitments pursuant to the U.S.-Bahrain Free Trade Agreement have not been fully implemented. There's evidence that the government denied public sector workers the right to organize, trade union leaders arrested, harassed, prosecuted, and intimidated. In addition, more than 2,800 workers were dismissed or suspended during the uprisings last year, and that affected more than 14,000 family members. Now, called out for the actions it took against these workers, the government has said that it hired many of the workers back. We can't find as much detail on this as we would like, but it seems that many of the workers were reassigned to lower paying jobs, or jobs that in effect didn't match their skills, didn't put them where they could fully contribute to the economy, and often were forced to sign loyalty oaths. So the actions of the Bahraini government have been concerning in my view, because I think the evidence I've cited deals with the ongoing violation of human rights of Bahrainis. And if that continues, I think what we'll see is something that every member of Congress is not going to like, and that is a Bahrain that is more fractured and a Bahrain that is less stable. And so if we continue to say we're with the regime, we're going to have these arms sales and the like, my concern is that this increases the risk of turning a population that has been friendly to the U.S. military presence on the island against us. So I think I would just wrap it up in the spirit of Congressman Burton's remarks, is we just got to stay at it until we find a solution to this, a political solution. And I just want to make it clear to colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I'm interested in working in both a bipartisan and a bicameral kind of fashion in order to achieve that. And again, to Congressman McGovern, it's been great to team up with you, and really grateful for your leadership.
Well, thank you very much, and I agree with you that we should work in a bipartisan and bicameral manner, which is kind of a radical idea around here. But the fact of the matter is, I think I appreciate your statement. I appreciate your leadership. And look, I mean, I've met on a number of occasions. I have the privilege of meeting with Bahraini officials who have assured me that they very much want reform and change. And I think part of what we need to do is figure out how we can assist them in achieving those reforms, which are, I think, to the benefit of all people in Bahrain, but also, I think, is to the benefit of the government, quite frankly. I appreciate you being here. I know that you're tight for time. I don't have any questions, but I do want to thank you very much for being here. And I don't know whether Mr. Burton or Ms. Woolsey have anything they want to add, or.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have anything to add at this time, but I would like to make some comments after we hear the next panel. Sure. But I want to thank Senator Wyden very much for coming over. I know he's very concerned about human rights, and we really appreciate that. We only wish that the Senate would listen to us once in a while.
Well, I would only say on that front, I'm not going to represent every senator, but I'm going back to the House to work for a bill that Jason Chaffetz and I put together on the cybersecurity issue. So point well taken. And look, up there on that side of the dais are Democrats and Republicans who spent a long time. You, Congressman Burton, Frank Wolf. I don't know the congressman from Minnesota well, but I hear great things about him from Senator Klobuchar. The point is, let's work together in a bipartisan way on this and generate the kind of progress that we all want that generates a real solution. And I thank colleagues. I see Congressman Moran as well, who's got a long record in this field as well. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. We're joined by my colleague Jim Moran from Virginia and Keith Ellison from Minnesota, also members of the Commission. At this point, I'd like to welcome the Honorable Michael H. Posner, Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And I should just warn everybody that there may be votes coming up. And so I'm told that there were 3 votes, so there may be like about a 15-minute delay if they come up. So please begin, Mr. Poser. Welcome. Thank you for always being so open to coming before this commission. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your for holding this hearing, for your great interest in these issues. I want to thank the other members for being here as well. For more than 60 years, the United States has worked closely with Bahrain. We have important strategic interests, shared political, economic, and security interests. The security relationship is particularly important today, as Congressman Burton has said, in the face of rising threats from Iran. At the same time, the demonstrations and violent confrontations that shook Bahrain last February and March were traumatic, and they were traumatic to all segments of Bahraini society. And though the violence has diminished significantly in recent months, Bahrain is still a deeply divided nation struggling to maintain or regain its equilibrium. Recognizing the importance of this relationship, I've traveled to Bahrain 5 times in the last 18 months, most recently in June, each time meeting with senior government officials, lawyers, journalists, medical professionals, civil society groups, human rights advocates, and political societies. My meetings focused on 3 areas that I want to briefly outline today. First is the current human rights situation in Bahrain. Second is the still urgent need for dialogue, which several of you have mentioned. And third are some measures that still need to be implemented as part of the BICI process, the Bassiouni report. In a number of ways, Bahrain today is more stable than it was a year ago. After a worrying period of rising violence several months ago in the street, where there was violence in the street by both demonstrators and police, the violence has subsided this summer. However, there are still almost nightly confrontations between young protesters and police, including a number that end in violence. The recent discovery of bomb-making materials punctuates the need for urgent action. More than a year after the release of the BICI report, we still see reports of continuing reprisals against Bahraini citizens who attempt to exercise their universal rights of free expression and assembly. Over the past month, the government has stopped granting permits for organized demonstrations in central Manama and has announced a study to identify suitable locations for protests. While the study may be a useful opportunity to initiate constructive dialogue, including with the opposition, it must not be used as a mechanism to restrict the universal right to peaceful protest. At the same time, we have urged Wifaq and others who organize demonstrations to do absolutely everything in their power to ensure that these gatherings remain peaceful. We've consistently condemned the use of Molotov cocktails, metal projectiles, and other violent measures by some demonstrators. We condemn that. We've also been consistent in our criticism of the use of excessive force by police, including tear gas, birdshot, and nightly raids and arrests of protesters. I want to focus on the need for dialogue. Since February and March of last year, there have been numerous calls, including by the Crown Prince, by President Obama, Secretary Clinton, other members of the international community, for a broad political dialogue that will lead the way forward on political reform. We need to strengthen moderate voices on all sides. Attempts at dialogue have broken down. On my recent visit, I observed that both people in the government and the political opposition felt in some ways that time is on their side. This is a misguided and dangerous perception. Therefore, we continue to encourage the government, all political organizations, and civil society to come to the table, as several of you have said, for a broad, open discussion about the political future of the country. We're now in the period of Ramadan, which is a time for calm. This is a moment, this is a good opportunity to recalibrate and to create an environment where dialogue is possible. This will require bold leadership on all sides, People are ready to negotiate now without preconditions and to trust the other sides to come to the table in a spirit of investment in Bahrain's political, economic, and social future. We also encourage the government and citizens to try to make progress on these issues, as well as on issues that matter to people in their everyday lives, such as policing, safety, health, education, and labor. We see the need both for a broad political dialogue and for discussions of these range of issues that affect people on a daily basis. We're encouraged by steps taken by the Minister of Interior to initiate some institutional reforms that will make police more accountable and professional. We await the results of an announced plan to hire 500 new officers who will better represent all segments of Bahraini society. And we welcome the announcement by the Minister of Interior earlier this week that his office will launch investigations of human rights violations by police officers documented in the BICI report, as well as a recent statement by the Crown Prince calling for police restraint. What underlies the use of excessive force by police and the violent tactics by protesters is a fundamental lack of trust between the police and the people whom the police are meant to serve. Trust can only begin to be established through genuine dialogue and negotiation between the police and the communities they serve. We need an environment that's conclusive to real constructive dialogue and result. Lastly, I want to just say a word about the BICI report and its implementation. We continue to encourage the government of Bahrain to fulfill its commitments to fully implement the recommendations of the BICI report. As Congressman Burton has noted accurately, there's been progress on a number of the recommendations, I think something like 18 out of 24 or 5. The government has taken important steps like removing arrest authority from the National Security Agency, drafting legislation concerning investigations and prosecutions of torture, drafting a code of conduct, as he mentioned, for police based on international best practices. It's allowed the Red Cross access to prisons, begun to build religious sites, and engaged a team of qualified experts, including John Timoney, to advise on policing and reform. However, the government needs to take full action on all of the BICI recommendations, including dropping charges against persons accused of offenses involving peaceful political expression last year, prosecuting those officials responsible for violations identified in the BICI report, and ensuring fair and expeditious trials and appeals cases, and continuing to work to professionalize and diversify Bahrain's security forces. There are several hundred pending criminal cases relating to the events of last February and March. I've been particularly focused on and disappointed that in the cases of medical professionals, those charges continue to be pursued in some cases. I also am urging, and we have had a range of discussions with government officials, that those accountable for the most egregious violations, such as cases involving torture where there were deaths in custody, those cases be fully investigated. There have been some investigations. Again, the Minister of Interior has said there will be more investigations, but we need to see successful prosecutions. But the key is reconciliation, and the key to reconciliation is a genuine dialogue and negotiation. So I want to encourage, again, all sides to come to the table for a meaningful negotiation to heal divisions within the society. As a partner and friend, the United States government stands ready to support the government and people of Bahrain as they seek pathways toward greater freedom and prosperity for all Bahrainis. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your testimony, and that was the bell for a vote, but so I'm going to try to be very quick here in my questions. You know, we're all talking about political solutions. Some have suggested that a high-level international mediator might be a good idea to kind of work with both sides to find a resolution. Do you think such a mediator could help the government and opposition find a resolution? And has the U.S. government suggested the idea of an international mediator to the Bahraini government? And if so, what is the government's response?
First and foremost, this is an issue for Bahrainis to resolve among themselves. We have stood to the side and stood behind both people in the government and people outside the government to quietly encourage that they find a way to navigate their differences. There needs to be an environment in which people begin to restore, there's a restoration of confidence and a sense that those negotiations are real. But ultimately, they're a negotiation among different parts of Bahraini society. So at this stage, I think our best role is, again, to be a quiet, supportive voice on the outside, but encouraging both the government and the political opposition, the various aspects of the political opposition, to find a way to get to the table, again, without conditions, to begin to negotiate how they move forward.
No, and I agree with that. I just we heard you know, that both sides have kind of dug their heels in. I'm just trying to figure out a way to encourage both sides to get together and work things out. Let me be very quick here. A number of major human rights organizations have issued reports on the situation in Bahrain, and they've been fairly critical. The Bahraini government, I think, has said to me that they think some of the accusations are exaggerated or just not true. I mean, I'm trying to. The administration obviously has. We have an embassy there. We have people. We have someone who's monitoring human rights. I was just. Well, what is the administration's assessment of some of the major human rights reports that have come out? Do you find them credible?
You know, I think I have a longer written statement which I'm going to ask be submitted to the record.
Without objection.
We do follow what's going on closely, and I've outlined a range of things that we consider to be ongoing problems, both the situation on the street, again, use of Molotov cocktails and violence by the demonstrators, totally unacceptable, but there's been an excessive use of force in response. Now, the violence has gone down. That's a positive sign. There are calls for restraint. We're encouraging that. But we still see the need for accountability for past abuses. We see the need for the cases from last year to be resolved. That's our assessment. I think the key thing is really we can debate, you know, particulars of what's gone on. The key now going forward is how do we make a difference and how do we move forward in a way that's going to begin to resolve these differences and create a more conducive climate for Bahrainis to come together. And I think, again, it's both the broad political dialogue and it's looking for ways to identify these day-to-day issues, right. Access to health care, the police, education, trying to find ways, as we've done as the Bahrainis have done to begun to do with the labor issue. The reinstatement of workers happened because the ILO came in, worked with the union, worked with the government, worked with the companies. Right. We've got to find a way to create that kind of an atmosphere where there's a greater respect and confidence.
Just two more quick questions. You know, some have been disappointed that the administration hasn't been more forceful in calling for the publicly calling for the release of Bahrainis who have been imprisoned only for peaceful expression. I know you mentioned the concern about that, but has the administration called for the release of Nabil Rajab? Because that's I think a case that many people think has been handled in an unjust way. Do you have an opinion on that?
Again, if you look at what we've said, what I've said over the last several months, we've said two things. One, in cases where people are being prosecuted for peaceful expression of their views, those cases should be dismissed and people released. There are other cases where there are allegations that go beyond that, and what we've said is the courts have to deal with those cases expeditiously and fairly. Due process has to be provided. We have said in a number of cases, the case of the doctors, for example, we've been very clear that those cases should not be pursued. Rajab's case is a bit more complicated on its facts, but we've been very clear there needs to be a due process of law. The case needs to be heard expeditiously. I think it's now been postponed until September, and we're urging the government in a range of these cases to deal with them expeditiously, fairly, and to err on the side of allowing people the right to peaceful protest.
Just one final question. You know, the BICI report recommended establishing an independent mechanism to hold accountable those throughout the chain of command who are responsible for deaths or torture. And that's, in your assessment, I mean, has that recommendation been meaningfully implemented?
What's happened is that there is a new unit in the Chief Prosecutor's Office that's dealing with these cases. The unit is still, in effect, being staffed up and in its early stages. They've initiated investigations in a number of cases. We've encouraged that, but we've also said to them, at the end of the day, what will be really meaningful is when those investigations lead to prosecutions and convictions. So we will continue to press for that.
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate your statement. Mr. Burton?
I think we have votes, and I have a number of comments I'd like to make. I'd just like to say to Mr. Posner, it was a very measured statement you made. I really appreciate that. It wasn't biased in one way or another, and I thought it was very factual. So I really appreciate that, but I'll make my comments later.
Ms. Woolsey?
Well, I have a quick question, and maybe you could help me with this. When you say encourage the Bahraini regime to do the right thing, how do we encourage? Is it through trade? Do we have is it financial aid, or is it more arms? I mean, why do they care what we have to say?
Well, I think there are a range of ways that we both have been and need to be doing. One is to express our commitment to a long-term relationship with, not only with the government, but with the Bahraini people, to hold hearings like this and express, you know, our different views, which is part of our system and a healthy thing to do. Again, I think on every level, both with the government and with the various parts of the political opposition, I think this is a moment where there is a need for everybody to take a deep breath and to redouble their efforts to think creatively about how to come to the table and talk about real differences. The society has divisions that are real. They're not going away until they're addressed by people sitting across the table and trying to figure out a way forward. We can't make that happen, but I think our steadfast attention and concern, trips like yours, trips like the ones I've taken, I think help encourage that. Our embassy is very involved. We've also maintained the security relationship in some ways, in important ways, because it's important to us, it's important to them. We've also held back on some things, and we've made it clear that we have concerns about some of the ongoing human rights issues and the lack of progress on dialogue. I think that's part of the process that we're all going through in this hearing.
Got a couple of minutes left. I don't know if Mr. Moran or Mr. Ellison want to add anything.
Well, I'd like to ask
Put your mic on.
the state of the media, Mr. Posner. How many TV or radio stations are not state-owned in Bahrain?
I can come back and
Are
give
there
you an
many?
answer,
I
but
mean, are there opposition voices that can be readily heard
yeah,
through the media? There are.
There are, and they're both opposition voices from within the country, and then because satellite TV is
They do
now
get
so much a
satellite
part of the
television,
landscape, people are getting all kinds of views. I would say one of the anxieties I have is that it's rhetorically charged on all sides. It is not the calmest media environment, and I think in some ways
There's no governmental effort at suppression of those voices.
No, there have been
okay.
some areas, cases where journalists have been harassed or
Sure, but there's
imprisoned.
not a-
Foreign
there's
journalists have been denied
not a
entry.
general
But there's
policy,
a lot
yeah.
of debate. It's
Yeah,
there's a lively
Good.
debate.
I
in the country.
just and just one other quickly. The BICI report said there were 5 illegally destroyed mosques. The USCIRF, the Religious Freedom Report, said 53 Shia religious structures. I don't know which is which, but there does seem to be reports that people were harassed when they were trying to pray on the sites of mosques. Has there been any effort to rebuild them? And that's all I wanted.
Yeah, just on the numbers, there were some very formal structures that you and I would call a mosque. There were other religious sites that were more
So
ad
both
hoc.
reports could have been
So
accurate. Yeah,
everybody's
okay.
got a slightly different number. The government has begun to rebuild and has made a commitment that it will do more in
Thank
that
you.
regard.
Thank you very much, Ms. Potts.
Mr. Ellison.
Yeah, thank you for your excellent testimony. Two quick questions. One is, what's the status of the trials of the 21 prominent activists who were leaders of the opposition? What's going on with that? And then also, I have endeavored to try to talk to people on the side of the government and others to get their point of view. And there seems to be some sense that there is external opposition or there's external forces fueling the opposition, particularly Iran. And I'd like to get your reaction on that.
On the trial of the activists, it's been postponed several times. I think the next hearing is on August 14th, but we continue to monitor that very closely. On the issue of outside influence, what I would say is there is certainly some indication, there's plenty of attention and observation of what's going on from Iran and from others in the Gulf region as well. But what's clear to me is that there are divisions within Bahrain that have nothing to do with anybody outside the country or what they're saying or doing. If it's not resolved, it's also clear to me if the country is not in a better place, the Iranian government is primed to be a beneficiary of that. And so one of the reasons I think we feel a sense of concern and that we need to move forward in terms of this negotiation or dialogue is to begin to bring the society together so that forces like the Iranians don't take advantage of the divisions that exist.
One last quick one. I just want to say Nabil Rajab has already been inquired about. He's a young man who allegedly had been detained for tweeting. Could you just remind us what his status is and what his condition is? Has he had ICRC attention? Is he okay? What's going on?
He is in detention. The case has been, as I said, adjourned until September. There are several charges against him, including taking part in an illegal gathering, but also inciting attacks on security forces. Mm-hmm. And the case is pending, and as I say, he's in detention. The case will be heard in September.
So I just want to say, the United States and Bahrain have a long-standing relationship. The relationship is very important to all of us. This hearing is an important commitment to our commitment to human rights anywhere and everywhere. And so, again, thank you for your comments.
No, and I appreciate that. We're very clear, and I'm in constant contact with people in our military. We have a national security interest. We have a security interest in Bahrain. We also have a very important human rights interest. And the key is to maintain both of those foci at the same time.
And let me just conclude by, again, thanking you for being here, saying that I think we're reassured that the administration is going to continue to raise the issue of human rights in Bahrain. I have to conclude by saying, as I said in the beginning, I think the optics of going forward with the arms sales is bad, quite frankly. I think that sends the wrong signal on human rights. That's my opinion. The administration has made a choice. I get it. But I think these particular cases, to the extent that we can monitor them closely and to make sure that, in fact, justice is being done, I think would be very, very helpful. And again, we appreciate your willingness to be here. And just one final thing on the negotiations. I mean, if there is a deadlock, it may be time for some creative, out-of-the-box thinking on how to maybe bring people together and resolve some of these differences, which I'm sure you're thinking about. But I just wanted to conclude with that, and I thank you again for being here.
Well, thank you, and we're open to suggestions always. So thank you all for your interest.
There's a vote going on. It'll probably be about like 15 minutes. So.